Greetings and welcome. My name is Jimmy May, and on behalf of myself and Aaron Daly, we would like to welcome you to this segment of the Good Legal Stories series, a corollary to the Good Legal Stories movement sponsored by the Normandy Chair for Peace. And that's an endeavor whose motto is, we will have peace on earth when we have peace with the earth. And to that end, the Good Legal Stories series spotlights landmark environmental advocacy from around the globe through the voices of those who made it happen. Today, we're delighted to welcome Dennis van Berkel, the director of the Climate Litigation Network, to share with us the story of the Urgenda case, one of the most remarkable legal stories on earth, finding an enforceable right to a stable climate. Aaron?
So let me introduce Dennis. Dennis is a climate change lawyer based in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, and he is legal counsel to the Urgenda Foundation, and as Jimmy mentioned, the director of the Climate Litigation Network, a part of the Urgenda Foundation. Now, Urgenda is known to everybody who follows climate litigation, but it is a Dutch organization that aims for a fast transition towards a sustainable society, with a focus on the transition toward a circular economy using renewable energy. So they're involved in many different aspects of protecting the earth from the impacts of climate change. What we know them best for is what's known as simply the Urgenda case, in which, as we mentioned, the Dutch Supreme Court found that the Dutch government has obligations to urgently and significantly reduce emissions in line with its human rights obligations. So Dennis, please tell us a little bit more about the Urgenda case.
My pleasure, Erin. Thank you for inviting me to be on this great show and project. So the Urgenda case was conceived in the around 2012. And the situation at the time in the Netherlands was not very different from many other countries. And that was that there was a recognition of the enormous threats that climate change posed, but complete political inertia. The politics basically told us, yes, we need to act and we need to do stuff, but the short answer was, we won't do anything unless all other countries act together with us. And at that time, that was not long after a very important climate conference that took place in 2009, and basically the global agreement that would solve everything completely blew up. So people were actually some people were quite desperate, especially in the climate movement. What do? We have this threat and politics is not acting. What tools are there to really push this system? And there was a lawyer called Roger Cox in the Netherlands, and he wrote a book called Revolution Justified. And in that book, he not only described the climate crisis, but he also described ways and legal tools how to basically create a court case where we said, well, you as a government, you actually have a duty to look after us. You have legal obligations to look after your people. And the fact that you are submitting us to these massive dangers that you agree are there and that you agree need to be solved, that's simply unlawful. You are behaving in an improper way, which is what we said in violation of their general duty of care under tort law. And we thought it was a violation, or that's what he claimed, a violation of human rights. And more specifically, the right to life and the right to private life, which are generally recognized rights. But he argued that the threats of climate change were now so big that those rights were actually engaged, that you could go to court and say, listen, my rights are being violated. My government needs to do something to protect us. And that means lowering emissions. So with the Urgenda Foundation, we took this up. I was a general or a legal counsel, became legal counsel to the Urgenda Foundation at the time that we started the case, and the case was actually the reason why I joined the organization at the time as legal counsel. And when we started the case, everybody said, well, that's nonsense, because climate change is something for politics and you can't really go to court. You can't be asking judges to do this. And we said, well, listen, we have rights, and those rights are being recognized, and actually under a democracy and under a rule of law, you can go to court to say, well, my rights are being violated. And we're in essence are not asking anything else but that the government keeps its word. And that was, what did the government promise, and not just the Dutch government? Already in 1992, so that was, more than 2 decades before we started with this case, governments around the world said, we need to prevent dangerous climate change. And then in 2010, they said, well, dangerous climate change, that's really when we go above this 2 degree level, 2 degrees of warming. And they also said, well, and science tells us, and it's this scientific panel, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, looked at the facts and said, well, if we want to keep below this level of 2 degrees, developed countries need to lower their emissions by a certain amount before 2020. And said, well, you recognize all these things, and we just want to keep you to your word. And we filed the case in 2013, and then in 2015 there was the court of first instance, that's the first lower instance court in the Netherlands, ruled in our favor, and that was a huge moment. The courtroom was flooded with people because we didn't just file the case on behalf of ourselves, but also on behalf of 886 Dutch residents that said, well, my life is at stake, my future is at stake, I want to claim my right in court. And the whole courtroom exploded. It was just enormous amounts of emotions, and everybody was so incredibly happy because of this realization that we had something in our hands, that we could finally break through this massive inertia, this political inertia that was holding us from making progress in fighting the climate crisis. So that in short is a bit of the background of the Urgenda case.
It's such a fantastic story. I mean, all of that and all the emotion involved, and what it leads to, and how it's inspiring people all around the globe. So let me ask you about that. I mean, what do you see as the ongoing impact of the Urgenda decision in the Netherlands, in Western Europe, on the continent, and throughout the globe?
Well, I think what the Urgenda case was one of the first cases where we said, well, we have this body of science, and in politics, there's all this discussion about, is climate change real? How bad is it, etc. But the science is so convincing. If you put it before a court, there will be no real debate about the broad lines of science. That was one of the things that we established in the court. The other thing was, well, listen, it might be that climate change is a big global problem that nobody can solve for themselves, but everybody has their own, or certain entities have their own responsibility with regards to that problem. And the main entities responsible for that are governments, because they actually themselves say that they are responsible for this problem. They go to all these climate negotiations, they close all these treaties, they have all sorts of climate policies. They basically claim responsibility over the problem. So they should also deliver on those responsibilities. And we did that on the basis of kind of like legal ideas and tools that are very common in almost all jurisdictions around the world. So there was nothing truly unique about our case that could not be replicated in other countries. So what happened, one of the things that happened is that loads of activists and lawyers around the world said, well, this is something that we need to also put pressure on our governments. And there are now, of these types of lawsuits, there are over 40 lawsuits of activists, and a lot of them are youth. Actually, most of them are filed by very young people that are saying it's my future on the line. And they're winning. So there are now wins before the Supreme Court in Colombia, but also in Ireland and in France and Belgium and Germany. So there's a sort of a hub here also in Europe, because I guess it's a bit close to where we're at, but this is really becoming a global movement. And also now you kind of like have this legal recognition in the legal community, and increasingly also in the courts, and therefore also in politics. We have legal obligations to reduce emissions and to protect our people against climate change. This is not a political conveniency that we can opt in or opt out. No, we have binding, lasting legal obligations to do this. That's with regards to government. But what you've also seen is that it really also helped a wave of consciousness amongst lawyers and NGOs and activists more broadly, that the law can really be a very powerful tool in the face of this climate crisis, especially because there's basically no more doubt about what the science is. And that means that you can't only hold your governments to account, but now there are also lawsuits against corporations for their role in the climate crisis. One of the examples, the main examples, is also a case here in the Netherlands against one of the biggest oil company in the world, Shell. It's a Dutch, partly Dutch and partly UK, and a group called Milieudefensie filed that case in a Dutch court, saying, well, you are such a big contributor to this problem. You also have an obligation and a responsibility to do your part in preventing that problem. And part of that is to lower your own emissions, and part of that is also to help your customers to also lower their emissions, simply by no longer offering them the products that are destroying this planet, but offering them alternatives. And they also won in court. So what you see is that because of this case, you really see a wave of litigation that keeps growing into different fields, and also into financial services, corporations, etc., where we say, well, we know what the risks are, and you need to act responsibly in the face of those risks. And that also means that you need to invest in the right things. You can't just keep selling the stuff that is causing this crisis. So that's kind of like, there's a lot of ripple effects and that came, where this case, you can say, played an important role. And now we do see that litigation is one of the main tools that people are using to push people to do the thing that they should be doing, without the litigation.
This story is so, just one little case, but so huge and so complex, and with such massive potential repercussions that you're feeling now and talking about, but also I think that we have yet to fully appreciate. Like, we'll see where the impact goes. But I want to ask you about what seems to me like it might have been one pivotal moment early on in your thinking about, do we even do this? You read this book and it lays out this roadmap, but then you have to say, are we actually going to try to put this into practice? And going back to something that you mentioned in your initial description of it, you were talking about sort of seeing climate change as this big political, scientific, complex problem, and then kind of realizing, but there are human rights at stake, and sort of transforming that big problem into a rights problem, a human rights problem. I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you saw the human rights implications of climate change and how you turned that complex issue into a legal argument.
Well, I mean, there was at the time some recognition that climate change was going to impact human rights, because we knew what the consequences were, especially in some of the areas which are the poorest areas in the world. People recognize that, if we continue down this path, a lot of people are going to die, or are going to have to move. So there was this recognition. But what the next step that we took in that case is that, well, these rights can be enforced in a legal system. And I think one of the steps that we also took is, well, those impacts, although they are first and foremost in kind of like the global south, no one is unaffected. We, as people in the Netherlands, actually in a country that largely lies below sea level, we are also affected. And that means that the current legal system that we have, in that legal system, we can use those human rights violations to claim that the state has acted unlawfully towards its citizens. And that's, this kind of like this concept of an unlawful act and tort law, to use that to claim that these human rights violations construct a violation of a duty of care on the state. That was kind of like the step that we took in this case, where we said, well, this is not just something from outside of our borders. This is something that we can really use also with regards to enforcing rights within our own borders. That means that the downside to it, you could say, is that in the case, we're only, because that's how legal systems work, or current legal systems, they're very imperfect. Right? So the tools that we had were very imperfect. We could not take into account all those horrific impacts outside of the Netherlands. That's not what our legal tools and our legal system are giving us at the time. What we really need is a global system where we treat this in the way that it needs to be, and that's kind of like a global system where we see, okay, what are the actions that we need to take, what is the finance that we need, etc., etc. But we also see that these climate negotiations have been largely failing for 3 decades now, and what we do see is that we have these older legal tools that we can actually use in this way to put pressure on the system.
Yeah, so sort of old wine in new bottles in that way. And let me ask you one more question, and then we'll let you go. This has just been fantastic. Thank you, Dennis. And that is that we're having this conversation during COP26. So COP26 in Glasgow is happening while we're talking. Now, by the time this recording is released, it's likely to be after that concludes. But as those negotiations are happening, what goes through your mind based upon what you hear coming from nations and statements that are being made in the context of the case that you litigated?
Well, I kind of force myself to have at least 2 thoughts. And I'll tell you the first and most primary thought, and that's anger. I become very angry because I hear lots of big words that you've been hearing for a long time from leaders that say we need to start acting, etc., etc. And then you see what comes out of it, and it's not nearly enough. I mean, we need to halve emissions in 10 years, and we're actually increasing emissions in the next 10 years. And we know this, right? And we had all these promises in Paris, and we said we're going to do it. And yeah, things change, but at the rate that they change, it's not nearly enough. And then within kind of like after that, the second thought that I have is, well, to force myself to look at the things that are changing, to look at progress that is being made, to look at the fact that more and more coal is being phased out, that more and more countries are putting an end date to coal, that now there is kind of already one of the things during this COP that a certain number of countries are agreeing on is that they're no longer going to finance fossil fuel infrastructure in other countries. So there are kind of like, even in the context of this COP, there are steps going forward, but it's also very clear that the real action, and we as kind of like citizens and youth and everyone, where we need to push hard is in our own capitals and in our own politics, because that's where the real change needs to happen. The change is not going to come from these international negotiations, etc. We need to be pushing all the buttons, and most of those buttons are in our own countries, our own towns, our own provinces, where we need to make people more conscious, feel more responsible, and act regardless of any obligations that is put on them for companies, right? Companies now need to take up their own responsibility in forging a way towards zero emission reductions, because if we wait for legal structures that are going to force us to go there, it's just going to be too late. So there's a lot of, I'd say it's you need to look for the progress, and you need to be an optimist in this space. And there is a way forward. We do see progress. And that should also give us confidence that if we keep pushing, we can actually get where we